Today we get introduces one of the most psychologically intense moments in Paradise Lost, Book 9, lines 795 to 833. Here, we witness Eve's soliloquy immediately after she eats the forbidden fruit. This is not just a moment of disobedience, but a turning point in human consciousness. Eve begins to reflect on what she has done, and we see a shift from innocence to self-awareness. Her thoughts reveal pride, curiosity, fear, and justification all at once. This passage is extremely important because it shows the inner conflict that follows sin, making it central for understanding Milton's portrayal of human nature and moral choice. In this slide, let us understand the great poet behind Paradise Lost, John Milton. He was born in 1608 in London and lived until 1674, becoming one of the greatest figures in English literature. He is often called the Prince of English Poets, because of the grandeur and power of his writing. The famous poet Alfred Tennyson praised his style as a God-gifted organ voice, highlighting its musical and majestic quality. One of the most remarkable aspects of Milton's life is his blindness. He became completely blind by 1652. Yet, despite this, he composed Paradise Lost entirely through dictation, which is an extraordinary intellectual achievement. Milton was also a rare genius who knew more than 10 languages, a fact often asked in competitive exams. Politically, he served as the Latin secretary to Oliver Cromwell, showing his active role in government. Religiously, he was a strong Puritan, deeply committed to the authority of the Bible. Interestingly, he was also nicknamed Milton the Divorcer, because he wrote controversial pamphlets supporting divorce, which was a bold and uncommon stance in his time. In this slide, we look at the most important works of John Milton, which are frequently asked in competitive exams. First, his major poetry, Paradise Lost, published in 1667, is his greatest epic, dealing with the fall of man and the story of Adam and Eve. Then comes Paradise Regained in 1671, which focuses on the temptation of Christ and shows spiritual victory, contrasting with the fall in Paradise Lost. In the same year, he also wrote Samson Agonists, a tragic drama based on the biblical hero Samson, reflecting themes of suffering, blindness, and inner strength, very similar to Milton's own life. Now, his prose works are extremely important for exams like NET and SET. Areopagitica is a powerful argument for the freedom of the press and against censorship, making it one of the earliest and strongest defenses of free speech. Of Education presents Milton's ideas on an ideal system of learning, combining moral and intellectual development. Finally, The Doctrine and Discipline of Divorce is a controversial work where Milton argues for the legitimacy of divorce, showing his bold and reformist thinking. Together, these works reveal Milton not only as a poet but also as a political thinker, educator, and social reformer. In this slide, we examine important critical opinions on John Milton, which are very useful for competitive exams. First, Samuel Johnson famously said that Milton was first in design, second in execution. By this, he meant that Milton's ideas, themes, and overall plan were grand and powerful, but sometimes the execution, especially the style and structure, could feel difficult or less effective. Next, T.S. Eliot criticized Milton's poetic style as artificial. He believed that Milton's language was too elevated and unnatural, influencing later poets in a negative way by making poetry less spontaneous and more rigid. Finally, William Wordsworth had a completely different view. In his sonnet London, 1802, he expresses a deep desire for Milton to return to life, seeing him as a moral and spiritual guide who could restore values in society. These contrasting views show how Milton's work has been both admired and criticized, making him a central and debated figure in English literary criticism. In this slide, we focus on the context of lines 795 to 833 from Paradise Lost by John Milton. These lines occur immediately after Eve eats the forbidden fruit, making this moment extremely crucial in the epic. This passage is presented as Eve's soliloquy, where she speaks her thoughts aloud, revealing her inner mind. It is a major psychological turning point in the poem, because for the first time, we clearly see the transformation in Eve's thinking, from innocence to self-conscious reasoning. The core text begins with the line, "O sovereign, virtuous, precious of all trees," where Eve praises the fruit and begins to justify her action. As the soliloquy progresses, her thoughts become more complex, mixing pride, desire for equality, fear, and emotional dependence. The passage ends with the powerful line, "Without him live no life," where Eve reflects on Adam, showing that despite her new sense of independence, she still feels deeply connected to him. This ending highlights the conflict between ambition and love, which becomes central to the tragedy that follows. In this slide, we analyze lines 795 to 800 from Paradise Lost by John Milton, which mark the beginning of Eve's soliloquy after eating the forbidden fruit. This is one of the most crucial psychological and moral moments in the epic. Eve begins with the line, "O sovereign, virtuous, precious of all trees," which is a clear example of apostrophe. She directly addresses the tree as if it were divine. This immediately shows her altered mental state. The use of three adjectives, sovereign, virtuous, and precious, forms a tricolon, creating a rhythmic and emphatic praise. Each word is loaded with meaning. Sovereign suggests supreme authority, virtuous implies moral goodness, and precious indicates great value. However, this praise is deeply misleading. The most important literary device here is dramatic irony. The reader knows that the tree is the source of sin and death, but Eve, under the influence of temptation, glorifies it as something holy and beneficial. This creates a tragic gap between reality and perception, which is central to Milton's theme of the fall. The phrase, "of Operation Blessed," suggests that the tree has a divine or sacred function. Eve believes that the fruit actively produces wisdom, to sapience. The word, sapience, is a key example of Milton's Latinate diction, which gives the poem a grand, elevated, and intellectual tone. At the same time, it shows Eve trying to justify her action through reasoning, as if gaining knowledge is worth disobedience. We also notice enjambment in these lines, where the sentence flows across multiple lines without a pause. This reflects the continuous and uncontrolled movement of Eve's thoughts, indicating a mind that is no longer calm or innocent, but restless and active. Her thinking is now driven by justification rather than obedience. Another important feature is paradox. The tree, which is actually the cause of death, is described using words associated with life, virtue, and blessing. This inversion of moral values shows how sin has already begun to distort Eve's understanding. What is evil appears good to her. This is a key idea in Milton's moral vision. There is also an element of blasphemous imitation. Eve treats the tree almost like a divine object, offering it praise and devotion. This reflects the influence of Satan, where something created is wrongly elevated to the status of the creator. This idea is very important for exams. False glorification is a sign of moral corruption. From a psychological perspective, this passage shows the beginning of self-justification. Eve does not feel guilt yet. Instead, she convinces herself that her action is right and even beneficial. This marks the transition from innocence to experience, from obedience to rationalization. Lines 795 to 800 combine apostrophe, tricolon, dramatic irony, paradox, enjambment, and elevated diction to present Eve's transformed consciousness. Milton uses these devices to show how temptation leads to false glorification and moral confusion. The key exam point is, Eve's praise of the tree reflects not truth, but a corrupted perception. This is the first stage of her psychological and moral downfall. In this slide, we analyze lines 800 to 805 from Paradise Lost by John Milton, where Eve continues her soliloquy and begins to reflect on the effect of the fruit she has just eaten. This passage is extremely important because it reveals the illusion of enlightenment that follows sin. Eve says, "Shall tend thee," which shows a shift in attitude. She now sees herself as a servant or devotee of the tree. This is significant because it suggests a reversal of natural order. Instead of obeying God, she chooses to serve a created object. This reflects idolatry, a key Miltonic idea, where something inferior is wrongly elevated to a divine status. The phrase, fertile burden ease, of thy full branches offered free to all, suggests abundance and generosity. Eve imagines the tree as a source of endless nourishment and blessing. Here, Milton uses imagery of fertility and abundance, which traditionally symbolizes life and growth. However, this is deeply ironic because the fruit actually brings death, not life. This again reinforces dramatic irony, where the reader knows the truth but the character is deceived. Eve then says, "Till dieted by thee I grow mature, in knowledge." This shows her belief that continuous consumption of the fruit will lead to intellectual and spiritual growth. The word, mature, is important. It suggests development and completion. But this is a false assumption, because the knowledge she gains is not divine wisdom but a distorted awareness of sin. The line, "as the gods who all things know," reflects her desire for godlike status. This directly connects to Satan's temptation, that eating the fruit will make her, like gods. Here, we see the theme of hubris or excessive pride. Eve begins to imagine herself elevated beyond her natural human limits. This is a key tragic flaw. Milton also uses enjambment again in this passage, allowing Eve's thoughts to flow continuously across lines. This mirrors her uncontrolled reasoning and growing self-deception. Her mind is active, but not guided by truth. The final line in this section, "Though others envy what they cannot give," reveals another psychological shift. Eve now imagines that others, perhaps even Adam or higher beings, will envy her for possessing this knowledge. This reflects pride and isolation, as she begins to separate herself from others and elevate her own experience. From a deeper philosophical perspective, this passage illustrates false consciousness. Eve believes she has gained enlightenment, but in reality, she has only entered a state of illusion. This connects to a central Miltonic theme, illusion versus reality. What appears as wisdom is actually ignorance. What seems like gain is truly loss. Lines 800 to 805 highlight the effects of the forbidden fruit through irony, imagery, enjambment, and the theme of hubris. Milton presents Eve's thoughts as a mixture of pride, illusion, and self-deception. The key exam idea is, Eve feels enlightened and elevated, but this is false consciousness, not true knowledge. This marks a deeper stage in her psychological and moral fall. In this slide, we analyze lines 806 to 810 from Paradise Lost by John Milton, where Eve's soliloquy deepens into a powerful illusion of intellectual and spiritual elevation. This section is crucial because it shows the growth of false power and pseudo-divinity in her mind after the fall. Eve begins by saying, "For had the gift been theirs, it had not here thus grown." Here, she assumes that if others, perhaps even God or higher beings, had possessed this knowledge, it would not have remained hidden. This reflects a subtle challenge to divine authority, suggesting that knowledge should be openly available. This is a sign of rebellious reasoning, influenced by satanic logic. The word, experience, is extremely important. Eve says, "Experience, next to thee I, best guide." This marks a philosophical shift, from obedience to experience. Earlier, divine command was her guide. Now, personal experience becomes her authority. This reflects a Renaissance-like idea, but in Milton's moral framework, it is dangerous because it replaces divine truth with subjective perception. The phrase, "not following thee, I had remained in ignorance," shows clear self-justification. Eve believes that disobedience has led her out of ignorance into knowledge. This is a classic example of paradox and irony. What she calls knowledge is actually moral blindness. Milton uses personification when Eve says the tree opens wisdom's way, and gives it access, though secret she retire. Here, wisdom is treated as a hidden figure who withdraws but can be accessed through the fruit. This creates a sense of mystery and sacredness around the act of disobedience. However, this is again a false elevation of sin, where evil is imagined as a pathway to enlightenment. We also observe enjambment, as the lines flow continuously, reflecting the rapid and uncontrolled expansion of Eve's thoughts. Her mind is no longer stable, it is actively constructing arguments to support her action. From a psychological perspective, this passage reveals a growing sense of power and superiority. Eve begins to feel that she has advanced beyond ordinary human limits. She imagines herself as more than human, approaching a godlike state. This reflects the tragic flaw of hubris, or excessive pride, which is central to the fall. The most important concept here is pseudo-divinity, a false sense of being godlike. Eve feels elevated, enlightened, and intellectually expanded, but this is not true divine wisdom. It is an illusion created by sin, a distorted consciousness that separates her from truth. Summary analysis. Lines 806 to 810 present a complex interplay of personification, irony, paradox, enjambment, and philosophical shift. Milton shows how Eve replaces obedience with experience, leading to self-deception and pride. The key exam point is, Eve's sense of enlightenment is not real, it is pseudo-divinity, a false god-like feeling produced by sin, marking a deeper stage in her psychological and moral fall. In this slide, we analyze lines 810 to 815 from Paradise Lost by John Milton, where Eve's soliloquy moves into a deeper stage of intellectual awakening, but a dangerous one. This passage is extremely important because it shows the first misuse of human reason after the fall. Eve begins with the line, "And I perhaps am secret," which immediately introduces the idea of secrecy and concealment. This reflects a psychological shift. She is now aware that her act must be hidden. This is the beginning of guilt consciousness, even though she does not fully admit guilt. The word secret carries strong connotations of isolation and inner division. She then reflects on heaven. Heaven is high, high and remote to see from thence distinct, each thing on earth. Here, Milton uses repetition, high, high, for emphasis, reinforcing the perceived distance between heaven and earth. Eve begins to imagine that God may not clearly observe human actions. This is a critical moment because it shows her attempting to limit divine omniscience through her own reasoning. The phrase, "other care perhaps," may have diverted from continual watch, reveals her flawed logic. Eve assumes that God might be occupied elsewhere and not constantly watching. This is a clear example of rationalization. She is using reason, but incorrectly, to justify her disobedience. Milton is showing that reason, when separated from obedience, becomes dangerous. The term, "our great forbidder," is highly significant. Instead of reverently calling God her creator, Eve reduces him to someone who simply forbids. This reflects a shift in perception of God, from a loving authority to a restrictive figure. This is also an example of ironic tone, because her language subtly challenges divine authority. Milton uses enjambment again, allowing Eve's thoughts to flow continuously across lines. This reflects her active, questioning mind, but also her instability. Her reasoning is expanding, but it is moving further away from truth. From a philosophical perspective, this passage marks the emergence of skeptical reasoning. Eve begins to question, why was the fruit forbidden? Does God truly see everything? What is the real consequence? These questions show intellectual activity, but without moral grounding. The most important concept here is the misuse of reason. In Milton's view, reason is a divine gift, but it must function under obedience to God. Eve, however, separates reason from obedience, leading to error. This becomes a key Miltonic idea. Reason without obedience leads to destruction. Summary analysis. Lines 810 to 815 highlight secrecy, repetition, irony, enjambment, and flawed reasoning. Milton presents Eve as intellectually active but morally misguided. The key exam point is, this passage represents the first misuse of reason in human history. Eve begins to question divine authority, but her reasoning is distorted by sin, leading her further into moral and psychological downfall. In this slide, we analyze lines 816 to 820 from Paradise Lost by John Milton, where Eve's soliloquy reaches a stage of inner conflict and moral confusion. This passage is crucial because it shows her beginning to think not just about knowledge, but about her relationship with Adam and the consequences of her action. Eve begins with, "But to Adam in what sort shall I appear?" This introduces a rhetorical question, a key literary device that reflects her internal debate. She is now self-conscious, aware that her identity has changed. This marks a psychological shift from self-justification to self-awareness and anxiety. She then asks whether she should make known, as yet my change, and give him to partake full happiness with me. Here, the word happiness is deeply ironic. Eve equates the fruit with happiness and fulfillment, but the reader knows it brings suffering and death. This is another example of dramatic irony, where her perception directly contradicts reality. The phrase, "or rather not," introduces a structural contrast, showing hesitation and divided thinking. Eve is torn between sharing the fruit with Adam or keeping the knowledge to herself. This moment reflects a deeper moral and relational conflict between love and self-interest. The line, "But keep the odds of knowledge in my power," is extremely important. The word odds suggests advantage or superiority. Eve begins to consider the idea of intellectual dominance over Adam. This introduces the theme of power dynamics in relationships, where knowledge becomes a tool for control rather than mutual growth. Milton uses enjambment again, allowing her thoughts to flow across lines without pause. This reflects the instability and rapid movement of her mind, as she struggles to make a decision. Her reasoning is no longer guided by innocence but by conflicting desires. From a thematic perspective, this passage presents a clear conflict between knowledge and law. Eve recognizes that the fruit gives knowledge, but she also knows that God has forbidden it. This creates a logical tension. How can something that seems good be forbidden? This confusion leads to what we call moral inversion, where good appears evil and evil appears good. This is where the concept of perverted logic becomes important. Eve uses reasoning, but her logic is distorted by sin. She begins to justify disobedience by redefining what is good and beneficial. This reflects a key Miltonic idea. Once moral order is broken, human reasoning becomes unreliable. Psychologically, we also see the beginning of separation and individuality. Eve starts to think independently of Adam, even considering withholding knowledge from him. This signals a breakdown of unity, which was central to their relationship before the fall. Lines 816 to 820 use rhetorical questions, irony, contrast, and enjambment to depict Eve's inner conflict. Milton presents a mind divided between love and pride, obedience and desire. The key exam point is, this passage shows moral confusion and perverted logic. Eve debates whether to share or withhold knowledge, revealing the beginning of division, power struggle, and deeper psychological fall.